As an MC, I have to say I was not expecting that very kind intro, so thank you, Salome. I have to say, this next presenter, I couldn't have written my book without his work. It really is a powerful body of work. So, without further ado, Chris Bennett is widely recognized as one of the foremost authorities on the history of cannabis, having written dozens of articles in Cannabis Culture, High Times, and other magazines, as well as 3 books dealing with the subject. And his books are like my book might be the entry, his books are like the Bible when you want to go on the deep dive. Very cool stuff. Bennett has identified evidence for a religious role for cannabis in a variety of ancient and modern religions, such as Hinduism, Islam, Zoroastrianism, I see if I got that right, Taoism, but his work regarding evidence in the Bible regarding the use of cannabis by both the ancient Jews and Christians has received the most attention. Most recently, Bennett has been working in video and making documentaries with interviews from a variety of academics and authors who have written about the role of cannabis in history. Please join me in welcoming our next presenter, Chris Bennett.
Well, thank you very much for that very kind intro. I've been a cannabis activist for about 30 years, and I've written, there's actually 4 books on cannabis, Green Gold, The Tree of Life, Marijuana and Magic and Religion, which came out in 1995. In 2001, I wrote Sex, Drugs, Violence in the Bible, which explored these references to cannabosum in the Hebrew works that a number of scholars have identified with cannabis and showed a role for that into the Christian period. My 3rd book, give you an idea about how big my books are. Cannabis and the Soma Solution took a look at the ancient Vedic sacrament Soma and the Zoroastrian drink Heoma, and through new archaeological evidence made a case for those preparations being prepared from cannabis. And from what I'll be presenting on today, my 4th book, Liber 420, Cannabis, Magical Herbs, and the Occult. And the term magic itself is thought to go back to the Zoroastrian magi. And they have a long and extensive history with cannabis. Cannabis is mentioned as a medicine in the Zendavesta. And in the Bunda Hish, chapter 4, verse 20, medical cannabis is described and applied for the dying first created ox who'd been poisoned by the Zoroastrian devil, Angru Manu. However, shamanic amounts were also used. In the Den Yash, Zoroaster's wife prayed that Zoroaster give her his good narcotic banga so that she might think according to the law, act according to the law, and live according to the law. And Darmester commented on this in his 19th century translation of the relevant passage, that this is the so-called bang of Zoroaster, and what must have been its virtue may be gathered from the legends of Vistaspa and Ardu Virath. And here's Hvove up in the corner getting lessons from her husband Zoroaster, and Vistaspa and Ardu Virath. And they were said to have been transported and sold to heaven and to have had the highest mysteries revealed to them after drinking from a preparation of cannabis-infused wines. Darmester mentions the Zoroastrian psychonauts Vistaspa and Ardu Virath, figures very important in religious conceptions such as heaven and hell and the end of the world. Vistaspa was a king, and he was said to be Zoroaster's first convert. And his texts were popular into the Roman period. There was an oracle of Hystaspes, that's the Greek version of Vistaspa, that was said to predict the end of Rome. And it was prohibited literature, and many scholars suggest that this is a kind of a template for the later Book of Revelation. In the medieval text, the Denkard, which was derived from lost Avestan sources, when Vistaspa drank bhang, he became unconscious immediately, and his soul was led to paradise, and it showed the value of accepting the religion. And as the Denkard itself writes, to enlighten Vistaspa and teach him, and that he would attain a high post, permanent power, riches, and food. Ora Mazda, the creator, sent at the same time to the house of Vistaspa an angel with a message urging Vistaspa to drink the enlightened drink that would grant his eyes to open and see the spiritual world. And so this is very important. And you know, these type of preparations were so powerful, they would often drink 3 cups of cannabis-infused wines, and it would knock them out for a day or two. And it's important to remember that the first anesthetic is thought to have been a cannabis-infused wine used in China about a century AD. And these cannabis-infused wines were very popular throughout the ancient world, and we see references to them in a number of places. Recently, actually, a discovery in France of about a 2,500-year-old gall site revealed that cannabis-infused wine was there, and it's believed to have been influenced by these Persian finds. And in some of the texts, it refers to it being mixed with hom. And hom is actually the Persian name for haoma, the beverage similar to soma. In modern rituals, hom is still drunk, but they take a drink of ephedra. And this is interesting because ephedra and cannabis, along with opium, have been found in the region of what is thought to be the Zoroastrian homeland, the Bactria Margiana archaeological complex, in huge temple sites. And a Russian archaeologist, Victor Sarianati, has scraped residue from old pots and things like that and found cannabis and ephedra in most sites and also opium in some later sites. In the Ardu Viraf Nimeg, Ardu Viraf was a Zoroastrian hero who was picked out in a time of turmoil among 7 righteous men by lots. And he was given 3 cups of this cannabis-infused preparation. And his visions that he had in his particular trip are thought to be the template for heaven and hell. He left and he saw the righteous rewarded in heaven and the evil being punished in hell. And, Mircea Eliade, when he was referring to this, a great religious scholar, said it was this aspect of shamanic ecstasy where the soul was believed to leave the body and travel that led to the concept of the soul itself and the concept of an afterlife. And we can see these preparations in use up into the 4th century. This is a picture of Zosimos, a very important figure in alchemy. And writing in the 4th century, he wrote, "Wines can be made in a multitude of ways, as shown through many accounts that authors have left us, and nature and art and such things. That is, growing wines from vineyards and medicinal, or by adding various spices like palm, cannabis, and certain brews of Egyptian beer, which is more powerful than our beers, are not lacking in the false and wicked arts." He's talking about magic here. "And might be better used for intoxication. These concoctions include borage, cannabis leaves, helium, ivy, strychnine, and darnel." And so these were clearly being used up into the 4th century. And, in this regard, Zosimos was considered one of the most pivotal figures in early alchemy, really a big influence on later medieval alchemy, and we see cannabis taking a major role in medieval alchemy as well. We can find references to cannabis-infused wines in the works of Paracelsus, in the works of Avicenna, in the works of Cardano, and in the Lullian corpus as well. So this was a major part. There's also these preparations were known as quintessences and arcanums. And they're basically cannabis-infused tinctures, and they also used other plants. There was a variety of these types of tinctures. This is a picture from a medieval manuscript called the Pikatrix. The Pikatrix actually originated in the Islamic world as the Gayat al-Hakim, which was written in the 10th century. And it used cannabis, opium, mandrake, other plants as well, varieties of nightshades and stuff like that for magical purposes. And in the 13th century, it was translated into Latin, became the Pikatrix. And this was one of the fundamental founding documents of the Western magical tradition. And in this recipe here, this is a recipe for invoking the servant of the moon. 1 pound and 1/5 of cannabis resin was used with tree resins and other substances, along with stag's blood, in order to invoke the servant of the moon. And it should be noted that most of these uses of drugs in the Pikatrix was through suffumigation, which is like burning it and inhaling the fumes. And in regards to this, we can see this type of use of substances in magic 2 millennia later, or millennia later. In regards to the use of blood and narcotics in the invocation recipe and throughout the Pikatrix, it is worth noting that the comments of Franz Hartmann, a German occultist and founding member of the Order Templi Orientis, who we'll be discussing later. The fumigation, which were used at former times for the purpose of rendering reason inactive and allowing the product of a passive imagination to appear in an objective state, were usually narcotic substances. Blood was only used for the purpose of furnishing the substance elemental and elementaries, by the aid of which they might render their bodies more dense and more visible. They wanted a really thick smoke because they saw the vision of the entity itself in the smoke. And it should be noted that, cannabis was by far from the only type of substance used in these types of magic. Datura, mandrake, henbane, all sorts of substances were used. This is an image from a recent translation of the Sefer Raziel, a 16th century English grimoire, and the Book of Oberon, a magical grimoire. That's Oberon, the fairy from Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream. And it's interesting, he's got a history tied with cannabis as well. And in the Sefer Raziel and the Book of Oberon, cannabis was used for seeing visions in front of magic mirrors. Magic mirrors were these black, opaque mirrors that you would stare into until you started to see visions, much like a crystal ball. Crystal balls were also used. And in these preparations here, they were used in the Sefer Raziel along with wormwood, which contains thujone, goes to the same receptor sites as cannabis. And in the Book of Oberon, they refer to the juice of the archangel. And this may be datura or something like that. These plants were known by that name, but it's unclear exactly what it is. And this was a very popular type of a magical use of cannabis in the 16th century. And in the center of this picture here, I have a picture of John Dee, and he's by one of these magic mirrors and a crystal ball. And I don't know if you know who Dr. John Dee is, but he was a scientist and magician who was part of Queen Elizabeth, the medieval Queen Elizabeth's magical court, and a very important figure in history, British history. And in Dee's own accounts of his invocations or actions, which we refer to as his magic mirror sessions, there is a reference to an elixir of some sort that induced a drowsy state in the recipient. It says, "Taste of this potion, yea, the savor only of the vessel worketh most extreme against the maimed drowsiness of ignorance. If ye hand be heavy, how weight and ponderous shall the whole world be?" And in one account of John Dee's action with the spirits, there's a lament about the lack of drugs for an operation and the use of ointments in their place. Dee's assistant, Edward Kelly, is speaking here. "I have forgotten all my drugs behind me. But since I know that some of you are well stored with sufficient ointments, I do intend to visit you with their help." And then he opens his apothecary box to show the entity in the mirror. "You see, all my apothecary boxes are empty." And this brings a response from the figure invoked. "How come it is that you pretend to come to me for favorable divine power and all your boxes are empty?" Now, Kelly was kind of a con man, and other things were in use at the time as well. Dee was also a student of Coonrath, who was a student of Paracelsus, who also prepared opium tinctures. His famous laudanum was such a tincture, which was basically a tincture of opium, so similar to these cannabis tinctures, but using opium. And they probably bought a lot of repeat customers because of the addictive qualities of opiates. And this type of use of magic continued on into the 19th century. Both of these individuals here, Pascal Beverly Randolph and Louis Alphonse Cagné, were using cannabis in conjunction with magic mirrors in the 19th century. So this was extremely popular in the occult movements of the 19th century. Pascal Beverly Randolph, in John Patrick Devaney's book, is said to have been probably the greatest importer of hashish into North America. He was a black guy, head of the Rosicrucian fraternity, also a sex magician. He lived from 1825 to 1875, good friend of Lincoln, fascinating character, and really an important figure in the history of cannabis. You can find old adverts of his hashish adverts in old newspapers and stuff like that, and really fascinating guy. Louis Alphonse Cagné, he wrote a book, Sanctuary of Spiritualism, and it was 15 first-hand accounts of people ingesting 3 grams of hashish or more in strong coffee and having these astral traveling experiences. And Pascal Beverly Randolph was a huge influence on the Order Templar Orientis, a group I mentioned earlier. And this was later to become the Grand Master of the OTO, or the Order Templar Orientis, Aleister Crowley, who lived from 1875 to 1947. And he was a really strong proponent of these forms of magic. Writing in a 1901 diary, Crowley recorded, "I think physical astral projection should be preceded by a ceremonial loosening of the girders of the soul. How to do it is the great problem. I incline to believe in drugs, if only one knew the right drugs." Well, he clearly came to see cannabis and mescaline as those drugs. And decades later, in his exquisite Kabbalistic treatise, Little Essays Towards the Truth, he wrote, "Such drugs as cannabis indica and anhelonium luini, an old name for mescaline, do actually loosen the girders of the soul." Now, this phrase, the loosening the girders of the soul, is interesting because it comes from Zoroastrian texts, the Chaldean Oracle of Zoroaster, as described by one Dr. Westcott, who was also the founder of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which Crowley later joined. And he wrote about cannabis himself, Dr. Wynne Westcott. "The cannabis plant, or Indian hemp, was given to produce mystic vision. The hashish of the Turks and Arabs, prepared from the cannabis indica plant, is credited with the power to give the rise to the dreams of intense pleasure, often of a sexual character. The old medieval magicians taught that dreams of different characteristics will be produced by sleeping in the presence of certain perfumes from the incense made from particular herbs." After he left the Golden Dawn, he got in a lot of trouble with them. He published all of their secret rituals. He became the head of the Order Templar Orientis, which I referred to earlier. Now, the Order Templar Orientis is a Masonic, quasi-Masonic type of group that claims to have knowledge going back to the Templar Knights. And they have a Gnostic Mass that they practice that is based on an opera by Richard Wagner, famous opera writer. And interestingly, I wrote recently an article about Wagner because the foremost Wagner autobiographer, he suggested, or he didn't suggest, he stated that Wagner received the inspiration to write the opera Parsifal after ingesting hashish, which he was turned on by the philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer. So some pretty big names there. And this OTO came to North America, and in fact, the first OTO lodge was here in Vancouver, in North Vancouver on Lonsdale Avenue in 1915. And one of the first items for reading was Crowley's 1909 essay, The Psychology of Hashish. And there was also references in these 1915 records of them ingesting mescaline and recording the results of these experiments with mescaline. And the head of this North Vancouver lodge was a figure Crowley referred to as his magical son, a Deep Cove resident of North Vancouver, Charles Stansfeld Jones. And the two, they worked together with hashish starting in 1910. They wrote about it. And then on April 20th, 1918, they recorded the use of hashish in a famous magical working they had done called the Antra working, very popular with occultists today even. And in 1918, he wrote a book to this North Vancouver resident, Charles Stansfeld Jones, that contained an essay, De Herbo Sanctissimo Arabico, the most holy grass of the Arabs, which begins, "Recall, O my son, the fable of the Hebrews, which they brought from the city of Babylon, how Nebuchadnezzar, the great king, being afflicted in spirit, did depart from men for 7 years' space, eating grass, as doth an ox." Now, the occult essay continues on with Crowley's statement that, "Yestereve came the spirit upon me that I also should eat this grass of the Arabians. And by the virtue of the bewitchment thereof, behold that which might be appointed for the enlightenment of mine eyes. Now then, of this I may not speak, seeing that it involveth the mystery of transcending of time, so that in 1 hour of the terrestrial measure did I gather the harvest of an aeon, and in 10 lives I could not declare it." Crowley ended the most holy grass of the Arabs with a comment that a man must first be an initiate and established in our law before he may use this method. Crowley is likely here referring to the codes of initiation in one of the occult organizations he belonged to, like the OTO or the AA. And he particularly felt that drugs alone were not enough to reach the higher goals that he was talking about, but a tool to be used for attaining those higher states of consciousness. And in a 1918 diary note, this is actually it's not working. Oh, here we go. This is actually Charles Stansfeld Jones, the guy I was talking about in Deep Cove here in North Vancouver. And pretty wild-looking guys, crazy hats. Must have had a lot of fun at their lodge meetings, taking cannabis and mescaline, I'm sure. In a 1918 diary note, Crowley made it quite clear the source of cannabis's magical properties. He stated, "Hashish brings the subconscious up into the consciousness." Now, this is a really important statement here, and I think is a pivotal reason why we see these references to cannabis and alchemy. And it's interesting, the concepts of the unconscious, as Jung referred to it, and as the subconscious, as Freud, his teacher, referred to it, is an aspect of consciousness below our normal waking levels of awareness. It's things like how our relationship with our mother affects our relationships with our wives, deeper things, programming that we've got down there that are making our interactions with the world more complex because of this kind of element of buried thought, And the concept that led to the unconscious and the subconscious being located, actually, the train of thought that led to that is through cannabis. And we have figures like Dr. J.J. Moreau, who wrote a book about hashish and mental illness. And he believed that when people were experiencing the high of cannabis, they were also experiencing an aspect of consciousness that we could feel in dreams, or that was happening to insane people when too much of this unconscious or subconscious information was rising to the surface, unmitigated by the barriers that are usually there. And I think this may be a reason why some people feel a lot of anxiety when they first start smoking cannabis. It's like the doors to the subconscious or unconscious are suddenly open, and thoughts that they've been repressing are suddenly flooding the brain, And this is really interesting, that this connection to the dream state and insanity. Like in a dream state, you kind of are basically schizophrenic in a way, because you're in the dream, you're telling yourself the dream, your other characters in the dream, and it's all your consciousness. And this is the interaction between the subconscious and the unconscious mind. And I really started pondering about this. And one thing that a lot of regular users of cannabis notice that's very common is a reduction in the amount we dream. And so I started looking into this, because a few times at night I'd wake up at about 4 a.m. and I'd smoke some cannabis to go back to bed, and I'd have the most intense dreams I ever had. And I said, well, that's weird. I thought cannabis suppresses dreams, but I just had the most intense dreams after I went to bed stoned. So I started looking into this, reading about melatonin. And in a book about melatonin, I read that in the 1980s, they did these experiments before and after cannabis consumption and melatonin levels. And they found that when people use cannabis, it spiked the regular daytime levels as much as 4,000 times regular daytime levels. So people are using cannabis through the day and their melatonin levels spiking, and it's depleted at night. And then I take it at 4 a.m, I'm in a deeper level of sleep, my melatonin level spikes, and I have intense dreams. And this is interesting in relation to the magic mirrors and the use of cannabis as an oracle. Because who is it that spoke to these guys from the magic mirror but the Emperor of Dreams? And the mirror is serving as a tool for accessing this area of the brain with cannabis that is we usually experience at night when we're dreaming, or when we're having mental breakdowns and this type of thoughts are raising into the brain. And in many ways, I think this is really interesting, and that these early researchers into this, like Dr. J.J. Moreau, they could be considered for mapping out consciousness in much the same way medical doctors now might be considered for mapping out the endocannabinoid system. And that through cannabis, we can come to this new understanding about the various deeper levels of consciousness, And I think this was the goal of alchemy, the marriage of the sun and the moon. The sun is our daytime awareness, and the moon is our nighttime awareness. And it's by bringing those two together that genius is achieved, that creativity. Creativity and madness are very close in a lot of ways. And I think that cannabis helps to bring up that inner genius, that stuff from the lower aspects of consciousness, and deliver it into consciousness. And I think that's really an amazing gift. Thanks very much.